I should have known something was off the first time I met Judith Whitmore. She had the look of someone who'd memorized every HOA bylaw like scripture and wielded them with the righteousness of a medieval inquisitor. Pearls, perfectly styled blonde bob, a crisp floral blouse tucked into aggressively beige capris. She didn't introduce herself with a handshake, just an appraising glance at my front yard, as if she were already tallying infractions. I'd just moved into Maple Ridge Estates, a neighborhood that looked idyllic on the surface. Neatly trimmed lawns, freshly paved streets, kids riding their bikes without a care. A place where neighbors brought over cookies when you moved in. Judith had brought a clipboard. "Welcome to our community," she said, in a tone that implied I should be thanking her personally for allowing me to exist within it. "I'm the president of the HOA." Her eyes flicked toward my driveway. At the time, I thought she was checking out my car. In retrospect, I think she was looking for weaknesses. I thanked her, not realizing I'd just unwittingly stepped onto the board of her personal game of chess. It started small. Tiny inconveniences. First, there were the passive-aggressive notices. A bright pink paper taped to my front door one morning. Trash bins must be moved within 30 minutes of pickup. No exceptions. Strike one. Strike one? Was she keeping score? Then came the friendly reminders. I left my porch light on overnight once, got an email at 5:30 a.m. with the subject line, "Neighborhood Aesthetic Matters." Judith had attached a screenshot of the HOA's 47-page guidelines. I wasn't even sure how she got my email. I ignored most of it. I figured, worst case, I'd rack up some petty fines and pay them off. But Judith wasn't satisfied with mild irritation. She wanted compliance, obedience, and that's when she noticed my solar panels. I'd had them installed a week ago, sleek, black, efficient. They cut my energy bill in half. To me, it was a no-brainer. To Judith, it was an act of war. At first, she tried the usual tactics: letters, notices, fines. "Your solar panels are a visual disruption to the uniform aesthetic of our neighborhood. Please remove them within 14 days. I sent a polite response, citing state law. She responded with a $500 fine for unapproved exterior modifications. That's when I knew I had a problem. It escalated fast. First came the gossip campaign. I'd be walking my dog, and suddenly the neighbors who used to smile now averted their eyes. Conversations quieted when I approached. The couple next door, who had once brought over banana bread, now muttered about certain people thinking they're above the rules. Then, the mysterious citations: the grass was half an inch too long, my front step was a tripping hazard, my mailbox was non-compliant. Each one came with a fine. My appeals disappeared into the HOA void, but the worst was yet to come. One morning I stepped outside and froze. My solar panels were pink, not just pink. A shrieking, unnatural nuclear pink. The kind of pink you'd see in a child's bedroom if the child had terrible taste and legally questionable access to spray paint. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't vandalism. It was deliberate. There, standing, on my lawn, was Judith Whitmore, arms folded in smug satisfaction. Next to her, 3 HOA board members, her loyal sycophants, watching like vultures. Behind them, parked neatly at the curb, a ladder and an industrial paint sprayer, still dripping. "You can't be serious." My voice came out flat, stunned. Judith beamed. "It was necessary." "Necessary?" She gestured vaguely to my roof. "Your panels were an eyesore. The bylaws clearly state that all visible home modifications must align with the neighborhood's aesthetic. And since you refused to remove them, we took corrective action." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You painted them?" Her smile didn't waver. "Pink is an HOA-approved color." I stared at her, at the ruined, utterly useless panels that had cost me thousands of dollars. The paint had seeped into every crevice, coating them in an impenetrable layer of pure spite. "Oh," she added, almost as an afterthought. "You'll also be receiving a fine for unapproved color choice unless you submit a request to keep them pink." Something inside me snapped. I'd played along with her absurdities. I'd tolerated the notices, the gossip, the petty fines. But this was something else. I took a step closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. You know this is illegal, right? Her smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew wider. Then by all means, take legal action. She wanted me to fight. Because she knew how these things played out. HOA disputes were a bureaucratic nightmare. They dragged on for years, draining you of time and money. Meanwhile, she held all the power. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. Not yet. Not here. Judith thought she'd won, that she could do whatever she wanted, that she was untouchable. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that she'd just made a mistake. A huge mistake, and I was going to make her pay for it. I forced a smile, the kind that probably looked more like bared teeth. You know, I said, tilting my head as if I were genuinely considering her audacity. I don't remember approving this paint job. Judith gave a tight laugh, the sort that people in power make when they think they've already won. It wasn't a request for approval. It was a correction. Her cronies, the HOA board, nodded in unison, like puppets. I looked back at my ruined solar panels, the paint still wet, glistening in the sun. I could smell it. Thick, chemical, a stench of control. I turned back to Judith, voice calm. So, let me get this straight. You climbed onto my private property, physically altered my home without consent, and are now fining me for it? Judith tilted her head the way a cat does when it finds an injured bird. Amused, delighted even. Yes. Great, I said. Just needed to be clear. Then I walked inside and slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. This wasn't just a power move anymore. This was personal. I spent the next several hours digging. I pored over the HOA bylaws, looking for anything I could use against her. I called my lawyer. I called my solar company. I researched every HOA lawsuit I could. Find in Judith? Judith kept going. By morning, the fine had doubled. By the next day, it tripled. Because now I was being penalized for failure to comply with board-mandated corrective action. The neighbors kept their distance. Some of them were afraid to be seen talking to me. Others weren't so subtle. I don't know why you're making this so difficult, my next-door neighbor Bethany muttered as she watered her geraniums. We all have to follow the rules. It's just how things work. I looked at her. She vandalized my property, Bethany sighed. Judith wouldn't do something like that unless she had a reason. A reason? She shuffled uncomfortably, then dropped her voice. Look, she's tough, but she's not unfair. She keeps things organized. People like that. People like that. I glanced up the street, watching as Judith stood on a neighbor's porch, clipboard in hand, issuing yet another fine. She wasn't a leader. She was a dictator in floral print capris, and people feared her. That night, I hatched a plan. If I wanted to beat Judith, I needed to stop playing defense. I needed leverage. I needed something she didn't see coming. So I started watching her, not in a creepy, standing outside her window way, more like a reconnaissance mission. I documented everything, the arbitrary, fines, the neighborhood patrols, the way she manipulated people into thinking she was the only thing standing between them and chaos. Then I went deeper. I started pulling records, financials, HOA expenditures, property tax filings. If there was a weakness, I was going to find it. Meanwhile, Judith escalated. She started weaponizing the HOA's power in ways that weren't just absurd. They were malicious. First, she threatened to revoke my parking privileges because my car exceeded the HOA's aesthetic standard. Next, she reported me to the city for improper home modifications. A complete lie. The inspector came out, took one look at my house, and said, "This is clearly retaliation." Then the board summoned me for an official disciplinary hearing. The email was short, cold. Failure to comply with Maple Ridge HOA regulations has resulted in a mandatory hearing to discuss fines and further actions. Further actions. Oh, I couldn't wait. The hearing was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile, over-air-conditioned space that smelled like lemon cleaner and self-importance. Judith sat at the head of the table, flanked by the other board members, her loyal yes men. A dozen residents sat behind me, watching. I wasn't sure if they were here out of morbid curiosity or fear, but I didn't care. Judith cleared her throat. We are here to discuss Mr. Carter's blatant disregard for HOA policies. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. We're really doing this? She smiled. Yes. She listed my violations, the unapproved solar panels, the failure to comply with corrective action, the fines I hadn't paid, because obviously I wasn't paying a dime. Then she delivered the big one. Due to these continued infractions, we will be placing a lien on your home until all outstanding fines are paid in full. There was a beat of silence. Then someone in the back gasped. There it was. The ultimate HOA weapon. The nuclear option. Judith folded her hands neatly, her expression carefully neutral. But I saw the gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. She thought she'd cornered me. I exhaled slowly. A lien, huh? Yes, she said, voice dripping with triumph. And unless this matter is resolved, further action may include foreclosure proceedings. My stomach tightened, not in fear, but in anger. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about property values. This was about control. I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough that she had to lean in to hear. You've really overplayed your hand this time, Judith. Her smile didn't waver. I don't make mistakes. And that's when I knew. I had her, because she had made a huge mistake, one I was about to use against her. I sat back, grinning. Well, this has been fun. But before we wrap up, I have a little surprise. Judith's smile twitched. Just for a second, I reached into my bag and pulled out a file, thick, full of neatly printed pages. Then I slid it across the table. Go ahead, I said. Take a look. She hesitated. For the first time since this started, she looked nervous. She opened the folder. Her face changed instantly. And in that moment, I saw it. The crack. The split-second flicker of fear. She looked up at me, and for the first time since this war began, she didn't look so smug anymore. I leaned back, in my chair, savoring the moment. For weeks, Judith Whitmore had played this game as if she were invincible, untouchable, a queen ruling over Maple Ridge Estates with an iron clipboard. But now, she was staring at the evidence in front of her, flipping through the pages with hands that weren't quite steady. I let the silence drag, let her stew in it. Then I said, almost casually, I wonder what the HOA members would think if they knew about this. Her eyes snapped up. This is ridiculous. But her voice had lost its usual confidence. Is it? I gestured toward the folder, the painstakingly compiled evidence I'd gathered. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty damning. See, Judith had overplayed her hand. Badly. She'd spent years lording over the HOA, enforcing ridiculous rules, terrorizing homeowners, and levying outrageous fines. But she had one fatal flaw. She was sloppy. She thought she was untouchable, so she never bothered covering her tracks. And I'd found them all. I'd dug into the HOA's financials, the expense reports, the suspicious consulting fees paid to companies that didn't seem to exist. I'd uncovered the ridiculous HOA dues increases that all just happened to benefit Judith's personal bank account. And my favorite? A juicy little city record showing that Judith had been quietly collecting fines for aesthetic violations, fines that were supposed to go into the community maintenance fund, but instead were funneling directly into an account under her name. Judith wasn't just power-hungry, she was a crook. Her fingers twitched as she turned the page, absorbing the full extent of her crimes. You can't prove this, she said, her voice tight. I smirked. Oh, but I can. I reached into my bag and pulled out the final piece of the puzzle, a USB drive. I took the liberty of making copies, I said, tossing it onto the table. I also forwarded them to a few interested parties. Judith's face turned a lovely shade of pale horror. Who? She demanded. I ticked them off on my fingers. Oh, let's see. The State HOA Regulatory Board, the IRS, the City Planning Commission, and, of course, a few local news stations. Thought they might find your creative bookkeeping interesting, The silence in the room was deafening. Judith's board members, her loyal lackeys, were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly realizing that their fearless leader wasn't as fearless as she pretended to be. Then, like the petty tyrant she was, Judith went for denial. "This is slander," she snapped. "You have no idea how HOA finances work. These are standard procedures." One of the board members, Steve, coughed. Judith? This, doesn't look standard." The other members were nodding now, exchanging nervous glances, sensing the sinking ship they were currently aboard. I turned in my seat, addressing the neighbors behind me, the ones who had come to watch my supposed downfall. "By the way," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "did you guys know that HOA presidents can be personally sued for financial misconduct?" A murmur swept through the crowd. Judith's mask cracked further. I turned back to her. "You tried to put a lien on my house because you didn't like my solar panels. But I think you're going to have way bigger problems when your misuse of HOA funds starts getting scrutinized." That was it. The death blow. Because Judith didn't just love power, she loved her money even more. And now, she was about to lose it all. The fallout was glorious. Judith's downfall was as dramatic as she was petty. Within days, HOA members were calling emergency meetings demanding answers. Within weeks, the IRS had started sniffing around her accounting practices. And within a month, Judith Whitmore had been forcibly removed from her position as HOA president. It wasn't even close. The very people who once feared her now turned on her with glee, tearing apart her legacy of tyranny one by one. She tried fighting back, sputtering about due process and false allegations, but it was over. She was done. The HOA board, desperate to save themselves, voted to dissolve every ridiculous rule Judith had ever put in place. No more arbitrary fines, no more nonsense bylaws, no more dictatorship. And the best part? My solar panels? They stayed exactly where they were. I saw Judith one last time before she packed up and left the neighborhood in disgrace. She was loading boxes into her car, her once pristine posture hunched, her signature smugness nowhere to be found. I leaned against my fence, watching. "Need help?" I asked, grinning. She glared at me. "Go to hell," I laughed. "You first." She slammed her car door shut and sped off. I stood there for a long moment, watching her disappear forever. Then, with a satisfied sigh, I turned and walked back inside, past my perfectly intact black solar panels gleaming in the sun. Poetic. Justice never looked so good. Epilogue Maple Ridge changed after Judith's downfall. The neighborhood meetings actually became productive. People started talking instead of whispering in fear. We rewrote the HOA rules, sensible guidelines instead of petty tyranny. Judith, meanwhile, word spread that she tried running for HOA president in another neighborhood a few towns over. She lost. Badly. Turns out, people talk. And nobody wanted a power-drunk dictator ruining their lives. As for me, I got a letter in the mail a few months later. No return address. Inside was a single pink paint swatch taped to a folded piece of paper. Written in small, bitter handwriting were 2 words. "You won." I laughed so hard I nearly cried. Yes, Judith, yes I did.